Okay, so we are determining if this function is 1 to 1. Now, third period I messed up. And part of my mess up was not remembering this right here. And we'll come back to talking about why this matters as we go further into this. But the bigger part of my mess up was what I did when I got when I got to a certain place in here. So let's look at that. Basically, I was rushing and didn't think. So here's what you do. Remember, the rule is if f of a equals f of b. So we're going to plug in a and we're going to plug in b. We're going to say, well, f of a would be a plus 3 squared, excuse me. And f of b would be b plus 3 squared. So if we're going to set f of a equal to f of b, then it'll look like this. Pretend that says equal, not equal. That should just say equal. Okay, here's where the problem happened. And it sounded like maybe somebody caught it but didn't say anything. I chose to do the wrong thing. I chose to do something that's legal, but it's not as helpful as doing something else. How can I reduce this? What can I do about this?
Take a square root.
Yeah. Don't ask me why. Instead of doing that, what do you think I could have done?
Foiled.
I foiled.
That's what I'm thinking too.
Yeah, well, don't. Because it makes it a lot more messy, okay? And a lot harder to see the facts of the matter. So let's go ahead and do the more obvious thing and take the square root of both sides. Okay, so I'm going to take the square root of this and say, take the square root of this. Okay, now this is where this domain restriction comes into play. Because normally, if we take the square root of both sides of an equation, what do we put in there that we didn't have before? A plus or minus. Okay? Normally we put in the plus or minus. Okay? And if we put in the plus or minus, it would still be pretty messy. Here's why we don't have to worry about the plus or minus if that's true. Because remember, a and b are just two different representatives of x values. If the x values have to be greater than or equal to -3, is this ever going to be negative? No, the smallest it could be is what?
-3.
What's -3 plus 3? 0. Okay, if x is greater than or equal to that, like if it's -2, it's 1. If it's -1, it's 2, and so on, then this is going to be positive and this is going to be positive. So I don't have to worry about the plus or minus. So that's where this domain restriction helps me out. Okay, so I can just say, well, that means then that a plus 3 would equal b plus 3. What could I do next to solve that?
-3.
Subtract 3 from both sides. And you get a equals b, which fits the definition. It says if this is true, then this is true. So yes, this is 1 to 1, assuming we use that domain restriction. Now, if we didn't use that domain restriction, what kind of shape is the original function? It's well, that's the type of equation, right? It's a parabola, right? We just were talking about this a second ago. That horizontal line test. If I have a parabola, and what was it, x minus 3? No, x plus 3. X plus 3, it's a horizontal shift which direction?
Right.
Left.
Left.
Left. So it looks like this. Okay, something like this. Okay, if I flip that across the line y equals x, then what's going to happen is you're going to have this. Is that a function? No, it's not a function. It wouldn't pass the vertical line test. But by restricting the domain to x is greater than or equal to -3, it removes this part. And now if I flip it across y equals x, is that a function? Yes. So now, with and only with that domain restriction, it's 1 to 1.
But it could say x is less than it.
See, look at where I did FOIL and everything. Horrible, horrible thought. Okay? Questions on that? Yes, sir.
But it could say x is less than or equal to -3.
Because it gets rid of the other side.
You're right. We could have done that. That's a good point. This domain restriction said x is greater than or equal to -3. This is part of your homework. That's a really good point. One of the things your homework does is says, do this. In other words, restrict the domain to make it 1 to 1. So there's a lot of ways you could have done that. Okay, the way the problem was written was x is going to be greater than or equal to negative 3. You could make x less than or equal to negative 3. And then it would just give you this side. That would work. That would also make it 1 to 1. You could have made it something somewhat random. You could have said, what about x is greater than or equal to negative 1? Okay, so it looks like this. And then like this. Something like that. That would also make it 1 to 1. So you're right. That is not the only domain restriction that will make it 1 to 1, but you do need that domain restriction for it to be 1 to 1.
But this is only for quadratics, right?
Right. Anything like that that would fail the which test?
The horizontal.
Horizontal line test. A quadratic fails the horizontal line test. So on its own, the whole thing with no domain restrictions is not going to be 1 to 1. We'd have to have a domain restriction for it to be 1 to 1.
How did you even come up with that domain restriction thing?
It was in the problem. I copied, this is one of the problems right next to one of the ones you're doing for homework. And it gives it as part of the problem. Yes, sir.
Anything with an exponent fail the vertical line, or the horizontal line?
Really good question. Depends on what kind of exponent. What about, the question was, doesn't everything with an exponent fail the vertical or the horizontal line test?
No.
What about this? That's just y equals x cubed. That doesn't fail. Okay? If
If you add stuff to
it would be like this, basically. And it's bigger than. But as long as it doesn't ever go exactly vertical, then you're fine. Okay? Now, like you said, if you added stuff to it, if instead of just being a kind of curvy looking thing, if it had maxes and mins or maxima and minima, if it looked like this, yeah, that would fail the horizontal line test, so that's not going to be 1 to 1. Because for different x values, I have the same y.
Well, if they give you the domain restriction, it can always be 1 to 1. Like
If they give you, assuming they give you the right domain restriction, then it could be anything, you're right. Anything could be 1 to 1 if you're looking at just the right part of the graph.